Hey everyone, it's Julian, and you're never too old for bedtime stories. Tonight we're going to be reading Chapter 8 of My Friend Flicka by Mary O'Hara. The 6-foot pasture, about a quarter-mile ahead, was a corner of land taken out of the stable pasture near the corrals. One point of it ran into the corrals. Two sides were in the stable pasture, one along the country road, and on the fore side the calf pasture ran up behind the hill and the green to meet it. It was called the 6-foot pasture because it was fenced with barbed wire to a height of 6 feet, the tightest and highest fences McLaughlin had on the ranch. In the far end of it, near the county road, were the 2-year-old stallions. When Ken and Howard reached the corrals, preparations were almost completed. Doc Hicks, 6'2" and built like a Hereford steer, never wasted time. A day's work often meant 3 or 4 such jobs as this, with perhaps 100 miles of Wyoming roads to cover in his high-powered, dusty black car, piled full of boxes and satchels, instruments, serums, bottles, lariats, and halters. The big vet and McLaughlin were talking together. At the same time that they kept an eye on what was going on, Tim mended the fences on the little round corral where the gelding was to be done, Doc's assistant bringing the lariat from the car, Gus tending the fire which had been built just outside the fence. The boys went close to their father and stood listening, and McLaughlin's hand dropped to Ken's shoulder in a natural, casual manner. It was an important, exciting day. "No, it's more of that black grease I want," said McLaughlin. "I've got a can in the stable. Come on, I'll show you." They walked off. Howard went over to Gus and looked at Doc's black leather bag where it stood on the grass beside the feed box, which Gus had overturned and covered with a piece of Nell's clean white sheet. In that bag were the instruments. Ken climbed the corral fence and sat watching the 2-year-olds. They were well-grown and well-fleshed. Their hides were glossy, their thick necks strongly arched, tails held up, curving proudly. A little group, too, closely bunched, suddenly became quarrelsome. 1 or 2 shot out, whirled and lashed. The others leaped and scattered. A golden sorrel dropped his head, stiffened his legs, twisted his body, and began to buck. When he finished, he stood looking about, as if for applause, shook himself violently, and then ran at another horse with head stretched out and teeth bared. Ken heard a squeal or two, the quick thunder of hooves. The sorrel got a tail lashed in his face and a pair of heels in his chest. 2 big blacks rose up on their hind legs and began to make-believe fight. They struck at each other with their forefeet then, curving beautifully, dropped sideways. The hairs of the tails and manes stood out strongly, moving with a separate life of their own. One head rose, curling over the other to nip at the back of the neck. The other stallion twisted out from under, reared higher, striking. They coiled and uncoiled inside the floating fringes of their hair in flowing, incessant movement, and the sun blazed down on them, making shining mirrors out of their round haunches and the bulging neck muscles. Ken felt the singing spirit of them, the young hearts, the free, overflowing power, and his hand tightened on the rail of the fence. A choking filled his throat. "I've got one too," he muttered. "Oh, you beauties! In a year, my yearling will be like you." Longing to be closer to them, he slipped down from the fence and ran to his father. "Dad, can I bring them in?" "Don't have to bring them in," said his father. "All I have to do is show them a bucket, and they'll come in of themselves. Go get me a bucket of oats." Coming back with the bucket, Ken paused to watch Doc Hicks opened his bag, laying out some instruments on the clean white sheet. Howard was kneeling beside him, absorbed, looking at each instrument. Howard liked things like that. Instruments, doctor stuff. Doc took out a jar out of his bag, filled it full of alcohol, and put on a pair of surgical scissors in it, and a small, sharp knife. "What's that?" asked Howard. "Scalpel," answered Doc. He looked at the boys, grinning in his rough way. "How'd you like to be doing it?" "I'd like it," said Howard promptly. "I'd like to be a vet." "How about you?" Ken didn't answer. The color was fading from his face. He tried to look scornful. The vet stood up and began pulling on his clean overall. Gus poured a basin of hot water for him. Doc took carbolic soap out of his bag and scrubbed his hands. Ken looked at the knives. The bucket of oats swung in his hands. Oats to lure the men, and then the knives. Bill was coiling the lariat. "Ken!" roared McLaughlin. "Come on with those oats!" Ken hurried to give his father the bucket, then climbed the fence again and took his seat right at the gate which opened from the 6-foot pasture into the round corral. They would have to come in through there, right by his feet. And over there, it would happen. Rob opened the gate and stood calling the stallions. He shook the bucket and whistled his trilling whistle. It carried to the colts, and several of them raised their heads from their grazing and looked at him. They all looked, standing still, facing him. One started to walk slowly towards him, then the others. In a moment they were all cantering, bearing down on him. McLaughlin fed them first, letting each one dip his mouth into the bucket and have a taste of oats, then let one through and closed the gate. The other colts stood there, crowding and pushing, now and then kicking at each other. Bill was ready with the lariat. They got the first colt running. McLaughlin and Tim made their short ropes sing, whirling them, and they all yelled and shouted. The colt looked terrified and began to gallop around the corral. "The faster he goes, the harder he falls," said Doc jocularly. The dust rose in a cloud, and scoops of sand and gravel from the colt's hooves hit the fence with a sound like a shot. Bill's eyes were as keen, as steady as a marksman, taking aim, as he stood in the middle, whirling the loop of his lariat. Suddenly, it snaked out along the ground. Both forefeet of the colt fell into it, and he went down with a crash, and Tim was kneeling on his head before he could move. McLaughlin and Gus tied his feet. Doc went in with his knife, and the colt screamed and tried to struggle. He was over in a minute. They loosed him, and he got to his feet. They opened the gate into the big corral, and the colt trotted in there and stood by the fence, head hanging down, blood streaming. One after another, they came in prancing, were thrown, castrated, then moved into the other corral. The men worked more and more quietly. Doc's joshing ceased. McLaughlin's face looked angry and strained. Everyone was sweating with the heat, and Doc's face, where he had wiped it up with the back of his hand, was smeared with blood. Ken had to hold on to the fence. It wasn't only the blood and the cutting. It was the way the colts stood when it was over. They crowded into a bunch in the corner of the big corral and stood motionless and shocked, one or two off alone by themselves. Between operations, McLaughlin went to them with a bucket of oats and offered it with gentle words. "Well, old boy, pretty tough, isn't it?" A few of the colts lifted their heads to the familiar voice, dipped their muzzles into the bucket, but most of them stood quiet and would not move. McLaughlin patted them, stroked their necks, comforted them. Tim, raking the strings and lumps of flesh and bloody skin into a pile, laughed and said, "If it was lambs now, we'd be having lamb fry for supper." They all laughed, McLaughlin too. There was just one left to do, a tall, well-built blue roan. Standing at the gate, waiting his turn, he had been nipping at Ken's feet and legs. Jingo his name was, and Ken remembered he had always had that trick of nipping at you, coming up behind you when you didn't know he was there, following you, and demanding attention with those little nips on the shoulder. McLaughlin, holding the bucket, opened the gate and Jingo went in. Ken felt he couldn't watch when Jingo was thrown and Tim sat on his head. But he ought to watch. Well, only this one and it would be over. Jingo screamed at the first cut, and after a moment Doc Hicks stood up and talked to McLaughlin. "Here's a Riesling," he said. I'll have a time with this one. There's only one down. What about it? Shall I go in after the other? The colt lay, hog-tied, Tim on his head. Ken heard snatches of the talk. Never any good. Either one thing nor the other. 15 or 20 minutes. Of course, it may kill him. Go ahead, said McLaughlin. None of the men joshed, or even spoke now while the vet worked, but the colt screamed and struggled terribly. Before the operation was over, he too was quiet, laying inert while bright streams of his blood darkened on the sand. Doc's arms were red to the elbow. At last it was over. Got it, said Doc, straightening up. When Tim got off Jingo's head, Jingo lay still and did not move. They shoved at him, but he didn't seem to feel it. Then Bill gave him a couple of good kicks in the haunches, and Jingo sprang up and trotted into the next corral. Ken felt himself going. He slid down the fence and stood with his face against it, hanging on. Look at the kid, said Bill, and McLaughlin turned, and in 2 strides was beside Ken. Here, here, he had him by the shoulder. Ken fought him off, furious, sobbing. Why, son! Ken broke away from his father, ducked through the bars of the fence, and vanished around the stable. He ran a long way, up the hill and into the pines, and threw himself face down on the ground. He was thinking of his own colt, a year from now, when they would be gelding it. He saw it suddenly, as clearly as if it was right before him. A bright golden sorrel like Banner. He saw the blood running down its legs. Sharp pains ran through him, and sobs strangled him. After a long time, he heard a car starting. The engine picked up. It was climbing the hill behind the house. The sound faded away. Doc Hicks was gone. Ken pounded the toe of his boot on the earth. He heard a Max struck close by and raised his head to see his father standing there, lighting his pipe. McLaughlin sat down beside his boy and puffed his pipe. He put out one arm and drew Ken close to him. Kenny. Oh, my colt, Dad, my colt. His father's arm held him tighter, and Ken pressed against it, crying bitterly. We'll read another chapter tomorrow night. Good night.